Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and I know I haven't made a video in a while, but you know, it was Christmas time. And besides that, I've been a little bit sick, and I still kind of don't have my voice back. So I'm not going to make a very long video. At least I say that. I don't know if I will or not. Depends on what I go off on. But you know, the other reason I've had a hard time getting back to it is because I just I didn't want to read Jude the Obscure during Christmas holiday. I just hate to say that, but it's true. And I was thinking back to when did I fall in love with Thomas Hardy and his work, and at the time I was in a very dark place. I was about 24 years old, I think, when I read it. I'd married at 21, had a child at 22, another one at 23, almost exactly. They're almost exactly a year apart. And I found myself also wanting a divorce by the time I was 25. And I felt absolutely stuck. And during that time, I guess I was really stuck. I mean, you're never stuck forever. But the way the universe looked to me at that point was a lot like what Thomas Hardy says it is. And I could understand how it would be a tragedy for something as simple as a boy didn't get to go to Oxford, because there's all sorts of things that follow it, as you'll see. So where we left off is Sue has run away. Basically, she has no idea how much trouble she's in at this point, and she is over at Jude's house. This is completely unheard of during this time. You don't do that. And so in the morning she wakes up, and as you see that Sue's very flippant. She says, gosh, you know, everything is different in the cold morning. You know, she sees the reality of what she's done, and now there's going to be consequences. So Sue kind of flies into stuff very passionately, and then says, oh my God, what have I done? The other thing that occurs to her is, what about Phillotson, your fiance? And he's going to find out about this. And she tells Jude, he's the only man in the world for whom I have any respect or fear. I hope he'll forgive me, but he'll scold me dreadfully, I expect. I'll go to him and explain everything, is what Jude says. And she says, oh no, you shan't. I don't care for him. He may think what he likes. I shall do as I choose. But you just said a minute ago, and this is exactly the way Sue operates. She is just in a constant struggle with herself. There's a part of her that is very secure and very independent, and there's a part of her that really is afraid of what will people think. And it's like she checks herself and says, well, wait a minute, I don't care what he thinks. I do care what he thinks. I don't, you know, she's always back and forth. And you could see this becomes very aggravating to any man, because she's like this in, you know, a romantic setting too. When they say goodbye to each other, Jude says, you know, I want to tell you something. I have two things. And she stops him and says, I already know what it is, and I don't want to hear it. You cannot love me. And after they leave, they end up writing each other a couple of letters. And so then she turns around and says in her letter, you've been so very good and kind to me that when you were out of sight, I felt what a cruel and ungrateful woman I was to say it. And it has reproached me ever since. If you want to love me, Jude, you may. I don't mind at all. And I'll never say again that you mustn't. Now, I won't write any more about that. See how quickly she changes the subject. Do you forgive your thoughtless friend for her cruelty, and won't make her miserable by saying you don't? Ever, Sue. Of course, it always says something like he forgives her straight away. But then he realizes that she's stopped answering his letters and she's not speaking to him. And of course, everyone during this time period expects the worst, because if you got sick, you very well could die. And so, he's in this great anxiety about her and decides he's going to come see her, whether she wants to see him or not. Phillotson does the same thing later on. And she says that, she was a little bit sick, but, not too bad. And here's the real reason why. They won't let me back in school, is what she says. So I couldn't write. Not the fact, but the reason. Well, they won't have me, and they gave me a little parting advice. What? And she doesn't really want to say it. She says, I vowed I'd never tell you, Jude. It's so vulgar and distressing. Well, what is it? It's about us? Yes. And she finally tells him and says, well, somebody has sent them baseless reports about us, and they say you and I ought to marry as soon as possible for the sake of my reputation. And then she goes on to kind of blame him for this. If I had reckoned upon marrying you, I shouldn't have come to you so often, and I never supposed you thought of such a thing as marrying me till the other evening. When I began to fancy that you did love me a little, perhaps I ought not to have been so intimate with you. It's all my fault. Everything is my fault, always. And so she goes back and forth of blaming and then blaming herself. And Hardy writes that the speech seemed a little forced and unreal, and they regarded each other with mutual distress. I was so blind at first, she went on. I didn't see what you felt at all. Oh, you have been unkind to me. You have to look upon me as a sweetheart without saying a word and leaving me to discover it myself. Your attitude to me has become known, and they naturally think we've been doing wrong. I'll never trust you again. And so this is basically how they leave that conversation. Even though she is the one who ran away and ran to Jude, it's somehow his fault, because she feels like he's the one that gave them the impression that he wants to be with me. And like I've said before in my other videos, I mean, once you start courting somebody and you start walking around with somebody, as innocent as that may be, men and women were not friends that way. They had to be chaperoned. And the truth, of what their true feelings are is revealed, whether they've done anything, publicly outright or not. People are going to know. And why is that important? Well, you see all through this entire book that every time they get a little bit more of some kind of scheme, which they would call it, it just seems very minor to us, but in Victorian times it was always a scandal. It was very serious, and the more scandals you have, the less likely you're going to be able to find a place to work and a place to live. So like I've said before, I've made the comparison of it's like getting a felony and then not being able to rebuild your life. It, especially for women, it ruins them. You already have been seen with Jude like this. He needs to marry you. Jude hasn't told Sue that he's already married. And of course they part, and then a letter comes, and you see this all through the novel, this back and forth with Sue. Forgive me for my petulance yesterday. I was horrid to you. I know it, and I feel perfectly miserable at my horridness. It was so dear of you not to be angry. Jude, please still keep me as your friend and associate, with all my faults. I'll try not to be like it again. I'm coming to Melchester on Saturday to get my things away from the training school. I could walk with you for half an hour if you would like. Your repentant Sue. And that pretty much sums up this chapter. And of course he says that Jude forgave her straight away and asked for her to call on him while he's working on the cathedral. The next chapter, I'm not going to go too much in because it's a very long description of Phillotson sitting there basically trying to study but unable to stop thinking about his elusive Sue, who has also written him that it would be very kind if you would try not to see me. And even though they're engaged. But, to save her the embarrassment and the trouble at the school, he's about to find out what happens. At this moment, he doesn't. But he, too, is sitting there trying to contemplate Sue's letters. What does she mean by this? And then turn around and say this. What does she mean by that? You can see how Sue would kind of drive a man to distraction. But this is a more thorough description of Phillotson that we haven't really got before, so I'll read this. The schoolmaster's was an unhealthy-looking, old-fashioned face, rendered more old-fashioned by his style of shaving. I would think he had those really thick sideburns. A certain gentlemanliness had been imparted to it by nature, suggesting an inherent wish to do rightly by all. He looks very innocent at the same time. His speech was a little slow, but the tones were sincere enough to make his hesitation no defect. His graying hair was curly and radiated from a point in the middle of his crown. There were 4 lines across his forehead, and he only wore spectacles when reading at night. It was almost certainly a renunciation forced upon him by his academic purpose, rather than a distaste for women, which had hitherto kept him from closing with one of the sex in marriage. In other words, why is he still a bachelor? You may say it might have something to do with how he looks. But I mean, we would have to assume that Phillotson is probably about at least 20 years older than Sue. So, if she's approaching 30, he'd be approaching 50. Or, I don't know, maybe he's 22 years older. It doesn't really specify. But at any rate, he's closer to probably her father's age than the other way around. And, with no fault of his own, he's just not a charismatic, hot guy. And he doesn't help himself probably by the way his characteristics are, I think before Hardy described him as kind of homely. So Jude is like this kind of rustic, sexy kind of, guy that you can't help but liking. But Phillotson, there's really not much to him. But what is important besides that is that if you think about what he says, that he didn't get married because of his pursuit of his academic endeavors. Think about that compared to Jude. Phillotson obviously has a lot of self-control, and Jude doesn't. He's not as impulsive as Jude, and yet he's still falling into this infatuation with Sue. He's already moved to a different school at Shaston. I think that's what it's called. And we'll see that it's going to be the next episode. The next part at Shaston. So they keep having to leave and go different places. Mainly because they keep screwing up their reputation and we gotta go. But there's only so many places that you can go. So when Jude meets back with Sue again, he decides he's going to tell her about Arabelle. But before that, Phillotson has decided that he's going to make an unexpected visit to Sue. And he goes to the school. He doesn't know what's happened. And then he's told what's happened, which, of course, is devastating to him. Because, he probably already suspects that Jude and Sue are a little more than just cousins. Any kind of relationship like that where two people would, seemingly be attracted to one another, you're going to have problems. Like the movie, and Harry Met Sally, great romantic comedy. Can women and men be friends, just friends, and be attracted to each other? And you kind of see by the end of the movie they get married. So no, sometimes they can't really. So he finds out, and he goes to the cathedral to talk to Jude, and Jude has to explain the whole thing to him, including the remark about how he should marry Sue. And Jude is very honest with Phillotson and says, "I wish I could," but then he kind of tries to take it back that he said that. I only mean that in the way of her reputation. If this would make everybody happy and take her back, that's what I would do. So they both know, like Phillotson knows you're my nemesis here. And he probably suspects that Sue does have feelings for Jude. And it's going to be a problem in their marriage. But Jude reassures him that nothing happened. It was all a mix-up. It was an accident. We slept in, separate rooms or whatever. And, they just happened to miss a train. Was basically what it all came down to. Huge misunderstanding. Of course, he didn't go into, we had some really intimate conversations, and then I kind of confessed my love to her. But no, they don't have to do that. So then he meets back up with Sue, and he decides, I've got to tell her about Arabella. I have not been completely honest with you. First he says, have you seen Phillotson? And she says, no, but I'm not going to be cross-examined about that. And he says, it's very odd that you're so nice in your letters, and then the minute you get back here, she's got this wall up against her again. But he says, I haven't told you all my history. And so he talks to her and he explains to her what happened with Arabella. And this makes Sue jealous. We know this because she says, I suppose she, your wife, is a very pretty woman, even if she's wicked. She's pretty enough as far as that goes. Prettier than I am, no doubt. You are not the least alike, he says. And then she pulls this religious thing on him, which people often do. How strange of you to stay apart from her like this, said Sue, her trembling lip and lumpy throat belying her irony. You, such a religious man. How will the demigods in your pantheon, I mean those legendary persons you call saints, intercede for you after this? Now, if I had done such a thing, it would have been different and not remarkable, for at least I don't regard marriage as a sacrament. Your theories are not so advanced as your practice. So she's pulling this, you're a Christian, which means you can't do anything wrong, ever. And if you do, then your whole faith is wrong. And this is a common argument. It is very, very true. But notice the legalism in it as well. The legalism comes from the other side, pointing a finger back and saying, see, the commandments. How dare you? And with her, she says, it wouldn't matter if it was me because I'm not a believer, but you should know better. How could you do this? And then she goes on to say, oh, you should have told me before you gave me the idea that you wanted to be allowed to love me. I had no feeling before that moment at the railway station, except, and this is what Hardy says, for once, Sue was as miserable as he. In her attempts to keep herself free from emotion and her less than half success. So every now and then the mask slips and she does have feelings for Jude. She's just very good at pushing them down. And you see this even it takes another turn. They begin to kind of rationalize. This is what happened. This is, they're talking it out. And so towards the end of this chapter, she says, you forget that I must have loved you and wanted to be your wife, even if there had been no obstacle, she said with gentle seriousness, which did not reveal her mind. still don't know what she's thinking. This is what she's saying. And then we are cousins. And it is bad for cousins to marry. And I'm engaged to somebody else. As to our going on together as we were going, in a sort of friendly way, the people round us would have made it unable to continue. Their views of the relations of man and woman are limited, meaning they don't have any platonic understanding of what we're going through. They're looking at it as she says, their views, the relations of man and woman are limited, as proved to their expelling me from school. Their philosophy only recognizes relations based on animal desire. The wide field of strong attachment, where desire plays at least only a secondary part, is ignored by them. A part of, who is it? Venus, Urania. And then this Hardy's interjecting and says, her being able to talk learnedly showed that she was the mistress of herself again. She's back in control. I almost lost it. I almost lost myself, but I'm pulling back. I'm withholding, like I've said before, very good at withholding herself. And before they parted, she almost had regained her vivacious glance, her reciprocity of tone, her gay manner, and her second thought attitude of critical largeness towards others of her age and sex. So I think in her mind, I'm not going to be one of these frivolous women who worry about this sort of thing. She kind of brings up, the people are just very close-minded about a relationship and what it can be. And these ideas go on as she's kind of getting married, not wanting to be married, and it's coming full circle, kind of with her views of her views of being in an intimate relationship and not being married, which is acceptable today, but it was not acceptable then. And this, Sue Bridehead is the one that really made critics angry. Because if this was coming out of a guy's voice, it might, he's a dandy, of course he wants to be a bachelor. But for a woman to say this at this time was, in a way, blasphemy. So this little chapter ends by saying their parting was in good friendship, and yet Jude's last look in her eyes was tinged with inquiry, for he felt that he did not even quite know her mind. And so I'm going to end with that, and then I'll do the next part, finish up Melchester all together next time. All right, thanks for listening. Okay, thanks.